And good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My name is Evan Weiner, and we're going back 40 years. And 40 years ago, I had a head of hair. There I am, doing an interview with Phil Simms when I was doing radio work in sports, and yeah, I had a big afro back in those days. Now look at me. But we're going back 40 years. And 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan delivered the Evil Empire speech, which was against the Soviet Union. There was also a strategic defense initiative, Reagan seeking space-age arms. You might remember a plane being shot down by the Soviet Union that was heading to Alaska off of Japan and Korea. False alarm, U.S. nukes and the Soviet Union. Beirut barracks bombing, nuclear conflict avoided. Grenada, the invasion of Grenada, and I have an interesting story about that from a guy who was there. The Iran-Iraq war started in it started before 1983, but was going strong in 1983. Margaret Thatcher wins big in England. Sally takes a ride. Remember Sally Ride, the astronaut? She took a ride. Gurion Bluford blasts off. He's the first African-American into space. Cabbage Patch Kids. Any of you buy Cabbage Patch Kids for your kids way back when? Well, that was a big deal in 1983, as was this, the Mario Brothers video game. The United States Football League gets off the ground in 1983, and Donald Trump would end up owning the New Jersey Generals in the USFL. And that's where I first met Donald Trump in late 1983 when he was the owner of the United States Football League's New Jersey Generals. But there is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is now in his third year as President of the United States, survived an assassination attempt in 1981. And this is the Evil Empire speech. On March 3rd, Ronald Reagan delivers his Evil Empire speech to the National Association of Evangelicals in Orlando, Florida. Reagan attacks the Soviet Union. Reagan was trying to make the case for deploying NATO nuclear-armed intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Western Europe as a response to the Soviets installing new nuclear-armed missiles in Eastern Europe. This is Reagan. Yes, let us pray for the salvation of all of those who live in totalitarian darkness. Pray they will discover the joy of knowing God. But until they do, let us be aware, while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipresence over the individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on earth, they are the fools of evil in the modern world. It wasn't supposed to be known as the Evil Empire speech, but it became known as the Evil Empire speech. So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggles between right and wrong and good and evil. The Evil Empire speech. But Reagan wanted to make sure that the United States was protected, and this would become the Strategic Defense Initiative. Ronald Reagan proposed it on March 23rd, 1983. He asked scientists who gave us nuclear weapons to turn their great talents to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. The proposed defense system was a highly advanced system that would rely on technology that had not yet been developed to intercept and prevent a nuclear missile attack on the United States by the Soviet Union. So there's Reagan, and Reagan is in the middle of the Cold War at this point, with a Soviet Union that is undergoing changes because all the old people who were running the Soviet Union are dying. They need some new blood in there. Defending defense, budget battles in Star Wars. And this is, of course, Star Wars, the big movie that had come out a few years earlier. Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, the Democrat, referred to Reagan's proposal as reckless Star Wars schemes. Despite criticisms from politicians, many scientists and others that the SDI was impractical, expensive, and dangerous, the concept was developed. Well, sort of developed. Really didn't get going. Samantha Smith, she was looking for peace, and she ends up in Moscow. July 7th, the American schoolgirl and peace advocate Samantha Smith visits the Soviet Union. She had been invited there by Yuri Andropov, who took over from Brezhnev, after writing him a letter about her concerns over nuclear war. Dear Mr. Andropov, my name is Samantha Smith. I'm 10 years old. Congratulations on your new job. I've been worrying about Russia and the United States getting into a nuclear war. Are you going to vote to have a war or not? If you aren't, please tell me how you're going to help not have a war. The question you don't have to answer, but at least I would like if it would. Why do you want to conquer the world, or at least our country? God made the world for us to share and take care of, not to fight over or have one group of people own it all. Please, let's not have what he wanted, and everybody be happy too. Sincerely, Samantha Smith. Well, the Soviets are kind of at Cold War with the Americans, and this was a plane that was shot down by the Soviets. Something to kill. The Soviets destroy an airliner. It's KLM 007, shot down by the Soviets. On September 1st, Korean Airlines, or KAL, Flight 007, was on the last leg of a flight from New York City to Seoul with a stopover in Anchorage, Alaska. As it approached its final destination, the plane began to veer off its normal course. In just a short time, the plane flew over Russian airspace, crossed over the Kamchatka Peninsula, where some of the top Soviet military installations were known to be located. The Soviets sent 2 fighters to intercept the plane. That is KLM. Of course, those are when airlines have relationships with one another. Korean Airlines, along with KLM, shot down by the Soviets. According to the tapes of conversations between the fighter pilots and the Soviet ground, the fighters quickly located the KLA flight and tried to make contact with the passenger jet. Failing to receive a response, one of the fighters fired a heat-seeking missile. KLA 007 was hit, plummeted into the Sea of Japan. All 269 people on board were killed. And that is some of the stuff that was recovered from the flight. The State Department suggested the Soviets knew the plane was unarmed. It was a civilian passenger aircraft. Reagan called the incident a massacre and issued a statement in which he declared that the Soviets had turned against the world and moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere. The President announced on September 16th that the Global Positioning System, GPS, which you now use today in this, your cell phone, would be made available for civilian use, free of charge, once completed, in order to avert similar navigational errors in the future. Well, this is a Russian colonel, Colonel Stanislav Petrov, and he makes a decision that may have saved a piece of the world. There's a false alarm. On September 27th, a Soviet early warning station received signals that 5 incoming American Minuteman intercontinental missiles had been launched from American bases. The duty officer was Colonel Petrov, and he made a split-second gut decision that proved to be correct. He concluded that a satellite glitch had triggered a false alarm. He later explained it was a gut decision, at best a 50-50 guess based on his distrust of the early warning system and the relative paucity of missiles that were launched. So he becomes a hero.
That was 83.
83. Remember that?
Yeah.
83.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Were you part of the military or
Yeah,
anything?
well, I was out by then, but I still was read it and stuff. So.
Oh, so you knew all about the what happened with Colonel Petrov.
Yeah.
Petrov. He was a hero.
Yes.
He was a hero. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, the Middle East woes continue, and this is 1983. Israel had become a state in 1948, so that is 35 years later, and the problems in the Middle East didn't disappear once England gave up Palestine, didn't disappear after the 1948 war or the 1956 war or the 1967 war or the 1973 war. Nor did it disappear after the Balfour Declaration by England in 1917. On August 23rd, the terrorist bombing attacks against U.S. and French armed forces on barracks in Beirut claimed 299 lives. The attacks which took place was amid sectarian conflicts of the extremely damaging Lebanese civil war. The Americans invaded Lebanon in 1958. I was doing a talk about 1958, and there was a guy who was on a ship that invaded Beirut in 1958, one of the Lebanese problems back then, and all of a sudden he says, we land on the beach, there are no soldiers there, just a whole bunch of women in bikinis. What were we supposed to do? But the Americans did land 1958 in Lebanon. That was all part of Eisenhower's Keep Our Friends Happy days back in 1958. A multinational peacekeeping force composed of troops from the United States, France, and Italy arrived in Lebanon in August 1982 as part of a ceasefire agreement signed by Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat. On April 18th, a car bomb destroyed the U.S. Embassy in the West Beirut area, killing dozens of American foreign service workers and Lebanese civilians. Although the notion of using a car or truck to deliver explosive to a target was not new, the suicide bombing of the U.S. Embassy represented a sea change in tactics for militia groups and terrorist organizations in the Middle East, and it is still used to this day. Here are the peacekeepers in the Lebanese Civil War. Israel and Lebanon signed a formal peace agreement the following month that called for the withdrawal of Israeli troops contingent upon Hafez moving Syrian troops out of Lebanon. But Syria said, no, we're not retreating, we're staying. In July, Israeli troops began a unilateral withdrawal from positions within Lebanon that they held since June of 1982. Fighting between competing militias escalated in the wake of the Israeli withdrawal, and the violence against the multinational force increased. Nuclear war again. According to classified documents that were released in 2021 in November 1983, the height of Cold War tensions, the United States and the Soviet Union came close to a nuclear war. Documents focused on a massive military training exercise known as Able Archer, in which NATO conducted or simulated the transition from conventional to nuclear conflict in the event of war in Europe. And top Soviet leaders thought the war game was real, that the United States and NATO were about ready to launch a nuclear strike against the USSR, and top Soviet military commanders took steps to retaliate. And this is Lieutenant General Leonid Perutz. Do you know who he was?
No.
Okay. The commander of the Soviet Fourth Army forces in Eastern Europe ordered all of his units to make make preparations for the immediate use of nuclear weapons. As part of that order, crewmen loaded actual nuclear bombs onto several combat planes. The Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz, the intelligence chief for the U.S. Armed Forces in Europe, saw the Soviet moves and stopped what might have otherwise been a deadly escalation. After Able Archer and thousands of American troops flew home, the Soviets unloaded their bombs and canceled their nuclear alert as well. So here you got two instances in 1 year.
I remember Able Archer. I didn't
Do you?
realize, yeah.
Well, now you know the rest of the story.
Yeah.
So twice in 1983, the world could have been blown up to smithereens.
Wow.
This is a picture of Grenada. I was in Grenada about 6 years ago, and I got a story behind this. And they have not fixed where the mass shootings took place. Where a local guy said, hey, they've got fireworks going on, let's go on to see what's going on. They must have a big celebration at the Capitol. Well, this, as of 6 years ago, looks pretty much the same as it did when the Grenada invasion took place. Ronald Reagan sent the troops to Grenada. It is October 25th, and President Ronald Reagan, citing the threat posed to American nationals on the Caribbean island of Grenada by that nation's Marxist regime, orders U.S. troops to invade and secure their safety. And approximately 1,000 Americans were in Grenada at the time, many of them going to medical school. In a little more than a week, the Grenada government was overthrown. Situation in Grenada had been a concern to American officials since 1979, or 4 years earlier, when the leftist Maurice Bishop seized power and began to develop close relations with Cuba. In 1983, another Marxist, Bernard Cord, had Bishop assassinated and took control of the government. This led to the formation of the Revolutionary Military Council with Hudson Austin, another Marxist, as chairman. Protesters clashed with police, with the new government as violence escalated. And there was the Grenada invasion. This is what it still looked like many years later. Many years later, about 33, 34 years afterwards. Reagan ordered about 2,000 U.S. troops into the island, where they soon found themselves facing opposition from the Grenada Armed Forces and groups of Cuban military engineers who were in Grenada to repair and expand the nation's airport. Reagan ordered in more troops, and by the time the fighting was done, the combined forces of the United States and Jamaica totaled nearly 7,000 troops. Nearly 20 of those troops were killed and 100 wounded. Over 60 Grenada and Cuban troops were killed. Cord's government collapsed and was replaced by Governor General Paul Scoon, who was acceptable to the United States. Again, when I was there a number of years ago, this guy is on the beach. He's a guitar player on the beach. And he comes up to me and my wife, and he says, would you like for me to play something? And my wife's a musician, a singer, said, sure, why not? He says, well, I don't pay unless I get a tip. And, well, we gave him a couple bucks, and he played, and then he started telling the story about the invasion of Grenada by the Americans and the Cubans who were there as well. And he said initially he and his friend are just hanging out at the beach, and they see all these fireworks all over the place. And they said, wow, there must be a real celebration up there. The guy might have been high as well. That's what he kind of inferred, that he was having a good time with his friend. And they start going up to the Capitol, and they see people running this way, all bleeding and all of that. And they said, well, what's the fireworks? He said, it's a coup. It's a coup. So he went back with his friends. They hid. And he said the Cubans, because everybody knew who the Cubans were, would go to the local houses and they'd hold up the people, not for money, but they wanted Grenada clothing. So they could blend in with everybody else there. And he said, they didn't have a party there. I said, no. And he said, the American troops were there, but they weren't told what to do. Do whatever you want when they were in Grenada. So he said it was an interesting time. And many years later, the guy was now in his 50s and still playing the guitar and still telling the story about how he and his friend wanted to go to the celebration, and they see all these people wounded and bleeding and all that other stuff. And he said, I think we were better off staying at the beach. The American Embassy in Kuwait. Yeah.
Clint Eastwood did a movie on Grenada.
Yeah.
He was a Marine or top sergeant or something.
Yeah, and
it was kind of a
similar story.
Yeah.
Similar story. Yeah. So maybe that's where the guy got it from, the Clint Eastwood movie. But he was one of these guys on the beach who made money off of tips and all that other stuff. And when I was in Grenada a number of years ago, Venezuela was building the infrastructure in Grenada. I don't know how that's gone since then, given what Venezuela is like today. The American Embassy in Kuwait was bombed. Reagan has all kinds of problems going around the world. Nearly 2 nuclear wars. He's got the Middle East problem in Lebanon with American troops. He also has the Grenada thing, and again the Middle East here in Kuwait. On December 12th, the American Embassy in Kuwait was hit by a truck loaded with explosives. The detonation does not go as planned, but 5 people are killed. Within the same hour, 5 other explosives are also attempted. Targets included the French Embassy, an oil refinery, the control tower at the Kuwait International Airport, as well as water and petrochemical plants. Though the bombs exploded, few people were injured as the bombs failed to detonate properly. Oh, and I forgot about this one too, Iraq and Iran. Of course, the United States problems with Iran didn't end with the release of the hostages in 1981. And by the way, I was at Stewart Air Force Base. I'm 24 years old covering. You're not going to see this anymore. 24-year-old radio guy from a local 500-watt radio station up covering the returning hostages from Iran. And I had to go to West Point because I had to be cleared at West Point, and they put us on buses, and there was a guy with a crew cut and had the thing in his ear and all that. And as we're going to Stewart Air Force Base, and this is January 1981, it's 2 degrees up there with the wind blasting out of the northwest. And in the middle, the guy says, okay, all you guys, you're not going to get a chance to talk to them because we didn't debrief them. All you're going to do is see them board the bus. So we had to change our tactic. So we're covering a story. And what we had to do, like everybody else, we had to do man in the street. And we had to interview, it was called Man in the Street, interview all the people who were lined up with their yellow ribbons and their flags and all that stuff. And I'll give you a secret of what we used to do those days. Payphones. That's the only way we could deal with our stuff in the field. We used to take the speaker out of the payphone. So we could use it, but nobody else could. So we could get our stuff done. It was me and a guy by the name of Bob Lemulek, who was at the other radio station. I said to him, the first thing we did, let's secure a phone, payphone, and let's get that speaker out. We did, and we did our stories. But we did cover the returning hostages, and they waved to us, and we waved to them. Anyway, that's Donald Rumsfeld. That's Saddam Hussein. And the Americans are monitoring the Iraq-Iran war. Rumsfeld visited Baghdad on December 20th as a high-level presidential envoy of Ronald Reagan. Rumsfeld would meet with Saddam Hussein. Iran is at war with Iraq. Washington wanted Iraq's friendship to box in Iran. So Reagan sends Rumsfeld over to say, hey Saddam, let's be friends. We know you're a murderous dictator. We know that Stalin was your hero. In fact, your mustache was the same as Joseph Stalin's mustache. But we need you as a friend. Can you help us? Because we want to get rid of that Iran and the Ayatollah and everybody else. The war was started by Iraq in 1980, and it was going Iran's way. In a national security decision, Directive 114 of the 26th November 1983, the U.S. made its objective clear. It wanted to protect its military force in the Gulf and protect oil supplies. Saddam could help Reagan and Rumsfeld, but Rumsfeld overlooked one thing. Iran was using chemical weapons against Iran. Iraq was using chemical Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iran and all of the people that Saddam Hussein killed. Meanwhile, there's another problem that Reagan's got to deal with. Yasser Arafat. Let me tell you a story about Yasser Arafat. This comes from a guy by the name of Bob Friedman. He's a teacher at Johns Hopkins University, or was, and we got to be friendly because we were on the cruise ship together for 2 weeks. He liked what I was talking about, and he was CIA, and he was in the U.S. military, and somehow, some way, he became an advisor to Israeli prime ministers. He met with Arafat in Tunisia, and he was telling me the story about Arafat because Arafat leaves Lebanon for Tunisia, and he says that he's there, he's meeting with Arafat. And Arafat's 3 hours late, and he says, he walks in, and Arafat looks at him and says, "You're Friedman, right?" He says, "Yeah, I'm Friedman." He says, "I got you kosher food over here, so you can have some kosher food, don't worry about it." And Bob says, "I didn't like that speech that you gave the other day." He said, "I forget that speech." He said, "I got to talk to them, I need their support." He said, "You know, I tell them whatever they need to hear. What do we need to talk about today?" And Bob told me that story about Arafat, that Arafat was basically a survivor. That's what he was, and he told Friedman, "Don't take what I say all that seriously." He leaves Lebanon. It's December 20th. The Palestinian Liberation Organization chairman Arafat evacuates Lebanon along with 4,000 loyalists. They expected to go to North Yemen and Tunisia. Arafat ended up in Egypt briefly. Meanwhile, Margaret Thatcher wins big in England, and Margaret Thatcher was high and low, high and low, high and low, and there she's meeting with Ronald Reagan. The United Kingdom's general election was held on June 9th, 1983, and it gave the Conservative Party, under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, the most decisive victory since the Labour Party in 1945 kicked out Winston Churchill, replaced him with Clement Attlee. She got a landslide victory. She got 144 seats. Thatcher was in trouble throughout her first term. Unemployment increased during the first 3 years of her premiership, and the economy was going through a recession. But a war makes her popular. Also, Rupert Murdoch helps her out a lot as well, because he's pushing in his papers how strong Margaret Thatcher is. The British victory in the Falkland Islands War in 1982 boosts her greatly, along with Rupert Murdoch pushing her in his London tabloids. And also, there was a recovery of personal property or her personal popularity, and the government had begun economic growth, and economic growth starts right after that war. Well, there's American educational woes. That's a thing that politicians love to talk about, education, education, and education, and how bad the American education system is. Well, we got another dose of that in 1983. It's April 26th, and members of the National Commission on Excellence in Education walked into the White House with a report for President Ronald Reagan. It was called A Nation at Risk. It was not a glowing paper. Our nation's at risk. Our once unchallenged preeminence in commerce, industry, science, and technology innovation is being overtaken by competitors throughout the world. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. International comparisons of student achievement completed a decade ago, 1973, revealed that on 19 academic tests, American students were never first or second, and in comparison with other industrialized countries, they were last 7 times. Some 23 million American adults are functionally illiterate by the simplest tests of everyday reading, writing, and comprehension. About 13% of 17-year-olds in the United States can be considered functionally illiterate. Functional illiteracy among minority youth might run as high as 40%. And this was the white paper handed in to President Ronald Reagan. The long list of recommendations to improve public schools included the adoption of rigorous standards, state and local tests to measure achievement, stronger graduation standards, sufficient financial resources, and curriculum changes to give students a solid grounding in basic subjects, as well as art and computer science. Well, we still hear about that today. I'm not sure if any white papers have been handed in, but that one was handed in 1983.
Well, local school boards,
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
no state
Yep.
or federal regulations.
No guidance.
No guidance.
No guidance. Abortion rights. We're still talking about abortion rights 40 years later. On June 15th, the Supreme Court of the United States reaffirmed the constitutional right to obtain an abortion and struck down an array of local legislative restrictions on access to abortions. In the most sweeping of the three decisions, the court declared unconstitutional an Akron, Ohio ordinance that placed a number of obstacles in the way, in the path of access to abortion. Meanwhile, 40 years later, the internment of Japanese Americans ruling. The Japanese Americans who were interned, as well as those in Canada who were interned in Canada, sued and sued and sued. This is from April 1st, 1942, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following areas. Most of the Japanese who were interned in the United States west of the Rocky Mountains, virtually nothing east of the Rocky Mountains. On February 24th, the Commission on Wartime Relocation said the internment of civilians created by U.S. Congress and signed into law by Franklin Roosevelt declares that the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War was unjust, and it recommended that the detainees receive $20,000 each in compensation. That was appealed as well. This thing, Kilauea, which is, I think, going again right now in the Big Island of Hawaii. This was I'm not sure. I guess this was in 2017. It was kind of not doing much. Yeah, it keeps going and going and going and going. The most recent eruption at that time struck on January 3rd when lava broke out of the fissures east of the summit. The lava fountains would eventually form a cone, which is now called Pu'u. Dr. Martin Luther King Day, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Day, signed into law by Ronald Reagan in 1983. It's November 20th, and Ronald Reagan signed it into law. It's called Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The celebration would start in January of 1986. The call for a national holiday to honor Dr. King's legacy began soon after his assassination in 1968. The representatives, the Democrat John Conyers from Michigan, introduced legislation to establish the holiday just 4 days after King was killed on April 4th, 1968, but Congress took no action on the bill. A bill to establish the holiday successfully passed through both houses of Congress in 1983 and was signed into law by Reagan in 83, November 20th. Oh, a fire on an airplane. This is the Air Canada plane, and it is going from Dallas-Fort Worth to Toronto. It's June the 2nd, breaks out in the toilet of Air Canada, Flight 797, carrying 41 passengers and 5 crew members. The plane was on its way to Toronto from the Metroplex in Texas. It landed at the Greater Cincinnati Airport, but the fire killed 23 people. As a result of the tragedy, the Aviation Authority ruled that all passenger jets should be fitted with smoke detectors. There were no smoke detectors prior to 1983, track lighting on the floor of the cabin, fire extinguishers, and that all flight crew be trained in fire safety. It also ordered materials to make seats within an aircraft to be made of a more flame retardant material. Sally Ride.
Oh, yeah.
Sally Ride. Sally Ride is a pioneer, so to speak. You know, the Americans plan to go back to the moon by 2026, and there will be a woman who will step foot on the moon. But Sally Ride was not the first woman astronaut. The Soviets had that, but she is the third woman astronaut, but first in American history. The third launched into space, Valentina Tereshkova and Svetlana Savakaya, 1982. First one's Tereshkova in 1963.
Sally was better looking.
Okay. Okay. She was one of 35 astronauts selected in 1978. And she was the first in the group of this particular group that was selected for space flight, which included women and minorities. She and 5 other women were chosen out of 8,000 applicants. The class dubbed themselves, even though there were 5 women there, 35 new guys. She was one of the first 4 of the new guys launched into orbit when she was a member of the Challenger's STS-7 crew, which lifted off on June 18th. There were the usual dumb questions from the media about women, African Americans, stupid questions, like Doug Williams. I'll give you an example. He was the Washington Redskins quarterback going into the Super Bowl. And he said something like, well, how does it feel to be an African-American quarterback? And he said, I don't know, just like any other game. He was asked a stupid question like that. Upon being asked if she wept when frustrated, Ride laughed and said, why don't you ask the STS-7 pilot, Rick Hawk, these questions? They were asking stupid women questions. There are stupid men questions too, but they didn't ask them. Gilliam Bluford, first African American into space. There he is in space. He went on the STS-8 Challenger, which went into space on a rainy August 30th morning. He was also one of the 35 new guys. Pioneer 10 launches an artist's drawing going by Pluto. It's time to look at the universe, look at our solar system. April 25th, the unmanned spacecraft, Pioneer 10, crosses the orbit of Pluto, making it the first craft to go beyond our solar system. That was when Pluto was a planet. He got demoted. Yeah, you're now a dwarf planet.
It's still pretty far out there.
It's far out there, but you're not a planet anymore. Don't even think of that anymore, but it's a planet. It was the first craft to go beyond the solar system. Pioneer 10 was launched on March 3rd, 1972. Between July 15th, 1972 and February 15th, 1973, it became the first spacecraft to take pictures of the asteroid belt. It also started taking pictures of Jupiter on November 6, 1973. And think of this, it takes 10 more years to get to Pluto. The craft completed the first mission ever to Jupiter and went off to other ventures, including a date with Pluto. There she is, Miss America, Vanessa Williams. First African American Miss America. When Miss America was a big deal at one time in this country. It's no longer a big deal. It's September 17th, 1983, and the 20-year-old Vanessa Williams becomes the first African American woman to win the Miss America crown. During the first 30 years of the Atlantic City pageant, African American women weren't even allowed to become contestants. In 1945, Bess Meyerson was the first Jewish Miss America, and prior to her crowning in Atlantic City, the Miss America promoters said to her, why don't you change your name to a less offensive sounding name than Meyerson? She refused. By the way, Bess Meyerson never got the perks associated with winning Miss America. How many of you watch this show? MASH. MASH, the 4077 says goodbye. Well, MASH ends and it has one of the biggest audiences ever in the history of TV to this day, except for now Super Bowls, which routinely get 130, 140 million viewers. Goodbye, farewell, and amen. Final episode of MASH airs on February 28, 1983, one of the most watched programs in television history. An estimated 105 million Americans viewed the 90-minute finale. MASH began on CBS in 1972. It was developed by Larry Gelbart. Now, I don't know if you know the history of Larry Gelbart, but Larry Gelbart was one of the writers, second batch of writers on Your Show of Shows with Imogene Coca and Sid Caesar. They brought him on with another guy. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy or not. He was a teenager. Woody Allen?
Oh, yeah.
They had some interesting, a guy named Melvin Kaminsky who changed his name to Mel Brooks. You ever hear of him?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He wrote on that show, and Carl Reiner, and Neil Simon, and Selma Diamond. They had some pretty good writers, except that guy Kaminsky. I've never found what he's ever done. You know, what's he ever done? Mel Brooks. Has he ever done anything?
History of the world.
History of the world. So anyway, it was an original spin-off of a 1970 feature film called MASH, which was based on Richard Hooker's 1968 novel MASH, a novel about 3 Army doctors. Co-written and directed by the MASH star Alan Alda, the episode covers the Korean War ceasefire, the dismantling of the 4077 MASH unit, and dispersal of the show's characters as they go home. Alda's character, Hawkeye Pierce, has a mental breakdown. His best friend, B.J. Honeycutt, gets sent home. Klinger, Max Klinger, who is a cross-dresser in the show and in the entire series, was trying to prove to his superiors that he was insane so he can leave, decides he's going to stay in Korea indefinitely. Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson had been a star since the Jackson 5, early 1970s, but he really becomes a star in 1983 with his moonwalking, or Moonwalk. He premiered his new song, Billie Jean, on May 16th, and he was taking part of a TV show called Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, Forever, filmed to celebrate the record album's greatest artists. Actually, it started out as a different label back in the late 1950s, 1959. So this was the 25th year of Motown instead of the 25-year anniversary. Don Mincher and the executive producers, Suzanne DePasse, banned everyone, including Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross, from performing new music. But Jackson had other ideas, and he was determined that he was going to perform a new song, the song Billie Jean. And unlike Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross, he won his battle, and he premiered Billie Jean. Speaking of Detroit, Motown was based in Detroit before moving out to California. Here's another Detroit resident, Madonna, who in 1983 is about ready to become a breakout star. Madonna and an old boyfriend, Steve Bray, wrote some songs together. She came up with the song Everybody, which became her first demo. After shopping the song around for a while, Sire Records agreed to give Madonna her first record deal in 1982. She released a self-titled album by the name of Madonna. The third single, Holiday, released on September 7th, landed on the Billboard Top 20. Any Madonna fans here? You are. I'm going to tell you a story. Story is about a guy I knew by the name of Gary LaForest, and we were supposed to actually, Helen O'Donnell, who was the daughter of JFK's chief of staff, Kenny O'Donnell, was putting together a magazine and was going to be called The New Frontier. I was going to work for them, except the magazine never got off the ground. She was also dating Chris Lawford, Peter Lawford's son at the time, and made sure I knew about it. But anyway, Gary LaForest, before he was in this venture, which was 2004, was telling me that he was in the record industry and that he was with Madonna back in the early 1980s when she was recording. And he said the problem with her was she had no voice. and that they had to use the old Les Paul, Mary Ford method of building Mary's voice up, except Mary could sing, and they had to build and build and build and build and build and build Madonna until she got a sound on the tape. He said she had the look. They knew she was going to be a big star because she had the look. She didn't have the voice to match the look, and they made sure that she had the look. She often, it was alleged, lip-synced at concerts. Karen Carpenter died. She could sing, actually, Karen Carpenter. She was 32 years old when she died on February 4th. Complications caused by eating disorder. She was anorexic, and it was called anorexia nervosa. The Carpenters, she and her brother, Richard, biggest selling groups of the 1970s. No fewer than 10 of their singles went on to be million sellers. How many of you had to buy a Cabbage Patch?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, how many of you had kids or grandkids? Your case, kids?
Yes, and
kids.
then after that, they had, Coleco had a computer.
Yes, they had a computer. Cabbage Patch. Fortunately, my daughter was only at that time about 5 months old. But here are people getting their Cabbage Patch dolls. And there are fights to get Cabbage Patch dolls. In 1976, Xavier Roberts met Martha Nelson Thomas at a craft fair. He asked her to supply her with dolls to sell in Georgia, where he lived and worked. Thomas briefly let her sell her doll babies, but stopped. Thomas sued Roberts and won. An undisclosed amount of the case was settled after court. Roberts created his own version of the doll in 1978. In 1982, he licensed the dolls to Coleco for mass production under the name Cabbage Patch Kids. Cabbage Patch Kids, well, that wasn't, they weren't cute. They didn't talk. They didn't wet the bed. Each doll had a unique name, adoption papers, and a birth certificate. The demand exceeded the supply. Starting on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving in the United States, people wanted to get these dolls, which led to in-store scuffles after a frenzy resale market. And by the end of the year, nearly 3 million Cabbage Patch Kids toys were sold. This also debuts video games. See, my game was Space Invaders at that time. I would play Space Invader. I wasn't very good at it. I would get to maybe the 5th board, and that would be it. Somebody said, that's kind of an accomplishment. I said, no, the amount of time I've wasted getting to the 5th board, I could have been something productive. But then again, I had a little kid at the time, and I was babysitting. I need something to do. Mario Brothers was released after a Nintendo arcade game in Japan on July 14th. The Mario Brothers game featured Mario and his brother Luigi. Any of you had kids or grandkids that were into the Mario Brothers? They were two plumbers who battled sewer creatures in New York. So did Ed Norton on The Honeymooners back in the 1950s. The game was not immediately successful. Fraggle Rock. This was another thing which I totally forgot about when my kids were growing up. They kind of look like Muppets, and they are Muppets. On January 10th, Jim Henson's Fraggle Rock debuted. It was designed to entertain while encouraging an understanding and embracing of diversity. There were 96 episodes, 100 original songs. The Fraggle Gang included Red, Gobo, Wembley, Booba, Moki, and Uncle Traveling Matt. The show featured a unique mix of music that incorporated several genres, including folk and blues and gospel to country and rock. Hello, cellular phone. Cellular phone looks like that today. Well, that's what it looked like 40 years ago. It's October 13th. David D. Mellon placed the first commercial wireless call on a Dynatec phone from his 1983 Mercedes-Benz 380 SL to Bob Barnett, the former president of the Ameritech Mobile Communications, who then placed the call on the Dynatec from inside the Chrysler convertible to the grandson of Alexander Graham Bell, who was in Germany for the event. You wanted to buy that cell phone? Well, it only would set you back $3,995. Today, probably that phone would be around $9,000. Oh, and say goodbye to the hand crank phone and switchboards. Number please, information please. On October 10th, Bryant Pond, Maine residents crowded a switchboard in Eldon Hathaway's living room and cheered as the last hand crank telephone system in the country was disconnected. Oh, I would love one of those phones today. With a tug of a few wires after 2 p.m., Mr. Hathaway and 2 officials from the Bryant Pond Telephone Company converted all local calls to dial service. The end of an era. Computers. I think I had something that looked like this, and I think it's still in my attic. Yeah, I think it's still in my attic. January 1st, the Internet takes another step towards its creation as Art Pennick, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, has moved from TCP/IP to that, the Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol. Microsoft announces Word, originally called Multi-Tool Word. In a marketing blitz, Microsoft distributed 450,000 discs containing a demonstration of its Word program in the November issue of PC Magazine, giving readers a chance to try the program for free.
Word still sucks.
Yeah, I still use it though. Still use it. CD players. Remember the CD player?
Oh, yeah.
I have one.
I wish I still had.
I have one. It's put away in a box. I'm never taking it out again. It's there with my 1950 Grundig radio, which includes shortwave. And I'm afraid to put that on because it's got tubes. Where am I going to get tubes to replace it? Well, I have a CD player. I do have one. I figure my grandkids, when they're about 60 years old, which would be in the year 2070, they're going to be sitting on a gold mine. Where are you going to get those? March 2nd, though they were already available in Japan, Europe, Sony and Philips released their CD players in America. A compact disc player cost over $1,000. And yet, they were extremely popular. Okay, I was covering sports. And I was covering the New Jersey Generals in 1983, 1984, 1985. So, I got to see Donald Trump a lot. I got to see Herschel Walker a lot. And it amazes me that all these years later, they are still relevant, but not in their particular area. Politics, they were. The United States Football League started life at a swanky New York hotel, May 11, 1982. With the start of play in February 1983. The league had franchises in Arizona, Tempe, Birmingham, Boston, Chicago, Denver, Detroit, Pontiac, Michigan, Los Angeles, New Jersey, East Rutherford, New Jersey, Oakland, Philadelphia, Tampa Bay, in Tampa, and Washington. Had a 2-year TV agreement with ABC and the fledgling ESPN cable network, and a national radio contract with ABC, and would play all of its games in the spring. This guy was not part of the original USFL, Donald Trump. Reason why? Well, when they gave out the franchises in 1982, he could not come up with the $2 million to buy a franchise. The story given, all of his money was tied up in the construction of Trump Tower.
Oh, yeah.
And he would come back in 1983 and bought the team from Walter Duncan, who really, he's from Oklahoma. He was an oil guy. He didn't want any part of New York. And he did the league a favor, and then Donald finally was able to enter the league. The league was beset by financial problems. Owners spent too much money. A lot of people blame him for the league's demise. He had a lot of partners in the demise of the league, the original owners, who didn't know what they were doing. The owners spent too much money on players based on attendance and TV. There was some appetite for spring football. Trump bought the Generals on September 22nd, 1983, and that was the day that I first met Donald Trump. And he was talking about how he was going to turn this franchise around. He would eventually steer the league into a different direction, compete against the National Football League in the spring. And he came up with the idea of condominium seats. He was going to build a stadium adjacent to Shea Stadium in the Junkyards, which now is going to be the home of NYCFC, the soccer team, they're building a stadium in the junkyards. And 2/3 of the stadium general seats, 1/3 of the stadium condos. You had to buy the seats at a very high price. He had the idea, but it never came to fruition. This guy was a bigamist. It was pretty big of him. Giovanni Vigliotto. On February 11th, Vigliotto is convicted and sentenced to 34 years in prison for fraud and bigamy. He's also fined $336,000. He claimed he married 105 women. Where would he have time? Who would he fight with? He would marry them, convince them to sell their home, and then disappear with all their belongings, which he would sell at a flea market. He married Patricia Ann Gardner of Mesa, Arizona in 1981, while he was still married to Sharon Clark of Fremont, Indiana. Gardner testified that he left after 3 weeks with $43,000 of her money. She had her husband tracked down and arrested in Florida. Clark also testified at Vigliotto's trial, saying that he fled with about $49,000 that belonged to her. Authorities confirmed at least 82 marriages in 9 states, Canada, Britain, Italy, and Hong Kong. That guy sure did get around, didn't he? Well, the 1983 legacy, the Cold War. Ronald Reagan, Yuri Andropov. The Strategic Defense Initiative Organization was set up in 1984 within the U.S. State Department of Defense, or Department of Defense, to oversee the development of Reagan's Star Wars idea. It was gone by 1993. The Clinton administration got rid of it. Within 4 months of the Beirut barracks bombing, elements of the multinational force began to withdraw to ships offshore. February 26, 1984, the last U.S. Marines left Beirut. Back in the 1990s, I don't know if you remember this name or not, Terry Waite. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy to Lebanon. And he was held 9 years in captivity. And I was the second person to speak to him as a free man. I did it for CBS Radio Network. This guy was about 6'9". And I said to him, "How were you treated?" He said, "I was treated rather well." Kidnappings in Beirut picked up in 1984. A lot of people were kidnapped, like Terry Waite. Soviet Union would fall in 1991. Nuclear weapons are still a global problem. Donald Rumsfeld's second visit soon after, March of 1984, cemented a U.S.-Iraqi relationship. The Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988. The U.S. would be at war with Iraq in 1989. The Supreme Court of the United States struck down Roe v. Wade, the abortion decision, on June 24, 2022. The decision drew worldwide commendation. The Middle East still remains a hot spot. Oh, a planet. Margaret Smith died in a plane crash at the age of 13, 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev, now the leader of the Soviet Union, sent his condolences to the family, saying, "Everyone in the Soviet Union who knew Samantha Smith will forever remember the image of the American girl who, like millions of Soviet men and women." Guy Bluford would fly 3 more times as a mission specialist aboard NASA space shuttles. Sally Ride's on the back of a quarter now. Dr. Sally Ride was part of one more space shuttle mission in 1984, flight that saw the first American woman to walk into space, Kathy Sullivan. In 2022, Dr. Sally Ride was honored, having her image appear on the back of a quarter for being a physicist and the first American woman in space. Radio communication with Pioneer 10, that went by Pluto, was lost on January 23rd, 2003, about 30 years after it was launched, because of the loss of electric power for its radio transmitter with the probe at a distance of 7.5 billion miles from Earth. Well, couldn't catch it anymore. Pluto is no longer a planet. August 2006, the International Astronomical Union downgraded the status to that of a dwarf planet. It seems Pluto has not cleared out its neighborhood. Pluto, which shares the orbital neighborhood with the Kuiper belt objects such as the Plutonos. Very few of the 1983 Election Education Commission's recommendations were enacted. Instead, politicians tried to shape schools politically, not with education in mind. And they're still doing it. In 1992, Arizona voters approved the celebration of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Day after the National Football League said Tempe would get the 1996 Super Bowl. Arizona voters said yes. The NFL pulled the 1993 Super Bowl out of Tempe in 1990 after Arizona voters said no to an MLK Day. Kilauea may have stopped erupting, but it started to erupt again. Oh, there he is. There's Mario. According to Billboard, Madonna is the most successful solo artist in Hot 100 chart history, second overall behind the Beatles, and the most successful dance club artist of all time. The Cabbage Patch Kids toys was one of the most successful new doll introductions in the history of the toy industry. Mario Brothers went on to be successful in American arcades. A Super Mario Brothers movie was released in 1986. The game is still popular. In 2022, an updated list by Rolling Stone, Michael Jackson's Thriller was ranked number 12. It was ranked by the National Association of Recording Merchandisers in conjunction with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. At number 3 on the list of the definitive 200 albums of all time, Beat It and Billie Jean were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. Vanessa Williams resigned as Miss America on July 23rd, 1984, after nude pictures of her appeared in the Penthouse. She's gone on. She's had a successful career in showbiz. The 2010 Super Bowl was the most watched TV program in U.S. history, overtaking the 27-year-old record held by the final episode of MASH. Fraggle Rock, Back to the Rock, was revived in January 2022 with new episodes 35 years after its 1980s run ended. On February 2nd, 1991, Giovanni Vigalato died of a brain hemorrhage at the age of 61, serving time in prison for bigamy. There is Donald Trump. There is Herschel Walker.
Oh my God.
And I was there that day. The United States Football League folded in 1986 after a jury awarded the business $1 in damages, which was tripled, after deciding the United States Football League did indeed violate antitrust laws in trying to drive the USFL out of business. They didn't need much to topple them over. The USFL owners did most of the work to kill themselves. And there's me. That's Lanny McDonald, who was a hockey player back in 1983 with a grand old mustache during the Stanley Cup run in 1983. And
Who did he skate for?
Calgary and Toronto and Colorado in his career. So anyway, he was winning some sort of award, and somebody took a picture of it and gave it to me, and it proves I once had hair. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? It's your turn to talk. Go ahead.
Wonderful.
Go ahead.